Before there were books, there were stones. Before there were letters, there were pictures scratched into wet clay by a hand that had never heard the word alphabet and had no idea that what it was doing would one day be called the birth of human civilization. Before every email, every text message, every novel, every love letter, every legal document, every recipe passed down through a family, every prayer written in the margin of an old book, before all of it, there was a small piece of clay, pressed flat by an ancient thumb, marked with a pointed stick, and left to dry in the sun of a city that no longer exists. And for thousands of years, nobody knew it was there. It was buried under the dust and rubble of centuries, hidden in the ruins of one of the oldest cities on Earth, sleeping in the same patient silence that ancient things always seem to carry with them, as if they know that time means nothing to them, as if they are perfectly content to wait forever for the right person to finally come along and understand what they are trying to say. The story of how humanity discovered its oldest written language is not a single dramatic moment like a lightning strike or an earthquake. It is something slower and stranger and in many ways more beautiful than that. It is the story of centuries of confusion, of brilliant people staring at mysterious symbols and understanding nothing, of political ambitions accidentally uncovering ancient secrets, of a young army officer sitting alone at a dusty desk with a handful of clay tablets and slowly, painstakingly, impossibly beginning to hear voices that had been silent for 5,000 years. It begins in a place called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek word that means the land between the rivers. Those rivers were the Tigris and the Euphrates, two great waterways that flow through what is now the modern country of Iraq. Between them, thousands of years ago, lay one of the most extraordinary places the human world has ever produced. The land was flat and fertile, flooded regularly by the rivers that nourished it, rich with the kind of dark, deep soil that makes things grow easily and abundantly. People had been living in this region for tens of thousands of years. But around 6,000 years ago, something began to happen in this flat, river-fed land that had never happened anywhere on Earth before. People began to gather not just in small family groups or wandering tribes, but in large, organized, permanent settlements. And those settlements grew, and grew, and grew, until they became something new, something the world had no word for yet because the world had never seen one before. They became cities. The greatest of these early cities was called Uruk. At its height, around 5,000 years ago, Uruk was home to somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 people, an almost incomprehensible number for its time, a crowd so large and so complex that it created problems nobody had ever had to solve before. How do you keep track of who owns which field when there are thousands of fields? How do you record how much grain has been stored in the temple warehouse when the numbers are too large for any single person to hold reliably in their memory? How do you manage trade between merchants when the transactions are too complex and too numerous to track with tokens and counting stones alone? The people of Uruk needed something new. Something that had never existed before. They needed a way to store information outside of human memory, a way to take the knowledge that lived inside one person's head and fix it onto a surface where it could survive that person's death, where it could be read by someone else, where it could travel across distance and time without changing or fading or being forgotten. They needed writing. And so they invented it. The earliest form of this writing was not made of letters or sounds. It was made of pictures, small, simplified images pressed into soft clay tablets using a pointed reed. A picture of a head meant a person. A picture of a bowl with wavy lines meant food or eating. A picture of a foot meant walking or going. These early symbols were called pictographs, and though they look simple to modern eyes, they represented something absolutely revolutionary. The idea that a mark on a surface could carry meaning independent of the person who made it. That information could be fixed, preserved, passed on. But pictures alone have limits. They can record things and quantities, but they struggle to capture abstract ideas, actions, relationships, the subtle and complicated texture of human thought and experience. And the people of ancient Sumer, the civilization that grew up around these early Mesopotamian cities, were not content with limits. They were practical, creative, endlessly inventive people, and over centuries they did something that still astonishes linguists and historians today. They transformed their pictographic system into something entirely new. They began to use symbols not to represent objects but to represent sounds. A picture of an arrow, which in Sumerian was pronounced T, began to be used to write the sound T even when the meaning had nothing to do with arrows. This leap, from a symbol meaning a thing to a symbol meaning a sound, was one of the most profound intellectual developments in the entire history of the human mind. It meant that the writing system could now capture not just nouns and quantities but verbs, adjectives, grammar, poetry, prayer, argument, story, and song. It meant that the full richness of human language, with all its nuance and complexity and beauty, could now be preserved in physical form. The result was a writing system that scholars today call cuneiform, a word that comes from the Latin for wedge-shaped, which perfectly describes what the script looks like. As the writing system developed, the pointed reed stylus was replaced by a stylus with a triangular tip, and the symbols evolved from rounded pictographic images into combinations of wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay at different angles. The result looks, to untrained modern eyes, like nothing so much as the tracks of a tiny bird walking across soft mud. Clusters of small angular marks that seem completely impenetrable and yet somehow carry the weight of 5,000 years of human thought. 4 centuries after the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations collapsed and their cities crumbled into dust, these clay tablets lay buried and forgotten. Tens of thousands of them, scattered across the ruins of Uruk and Ur and Nippur and Babylon and Nineveh, covered by centuries of sand and rubble. Occasional travelers passing through the region noticed strange bricks in the ruins with odd markings on them. Some collected them as curiosities. Some ground them up and used them as building material, not knowing that they were destroying irreplaceable records of the oldest human civilization on Earth. And some stared at the markings with genuine curiosity and wondered, without any real way of finding an answer, what they meant and who had made them. The serious effort to understand cuneiform began in the 17th and 18th centuries, when European travelers and scholars started bringing back tablets and inscriptions from Persia and Mesopotamia and trying to make sense of them. It was painstaking, frustrating, often maddening work. The script was unlike anything in any known writing tradition. There were no bilingual texts, no equivalent of the Rosetta Stone that had unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics. There were no living speakers of the ancient language. There was nothing to hold on to, just thousands of wedge marks staring back at the scholars who stared at them, silent and inscrutable and utterly foreign. Progress was slow and came in fragments. Scholars noticed that certain groups of symbols appeared repeatedly in the same positions, suggesting that they might represent proper names of kings or gods, which were likely to be repeated in royal inscriptions. A German scholar named George Friedrich Grotefend made a crucial early breakthrough in 1802, correctly identifying the names of several Persian kings in a set of trilingual inscriptions carved into a cliff face at a place called Behistun in what is now Iran. It was a small crack of light in a very dark room, but it was enough to show that the room was not completely sealed. The man who finally opened the door, who broke the code wide open and let the full light of 5,000 years of Sumerian and Akkadian civilization pour into the modern world, was an unlikely hero. His name was Henry Rawlinson, and he was not a scholar in the traditional sense. He was a British Army officer, athletic and adventurous, stationed in Persia in the 1830s as a military advisor to the Persian army. He had taught himself Old Persian as a hobby, the way some people learn to play an instrument or paint watercolors in their spare time. And he had heard about the great trilingual inscription at Behistun, a massive cliff face carved on the orders of the Persian king Darius the Great around 500 BC, recording the same text in 3 different scripts, including Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. The inscription was carved high on a sheer cliff face, deliberately placed out of reach to protect it from defacement. Reaching it required courage that bordered on recklessness. Rawlinson scaled the cliff face repeatedly over several years, hanging from ropes, balancing on narrow ledges hundreds of feet above the ground, pressing paper against the carved rock to take impressions of the inscriptions he could reach and squinting at the sections he could not. He was not doing it for academic recognition. He was doing it because he was genuinely, passionately, almost desperately curious. Because those marks on the cliff face were speaking a language he could not yet hear, and the thought of them remaining silent was more than he could stand. By 1851, after years of painstaking work, Rawlinson had succeeded in deciphering enough of the Babylonian cuneiform column of the Behistun inscription to unlock the broader system. Working alongside other brilliant scholars who were simultaneously attacking the same problem from different angles, Men like Edward Hincks in Ireland and Jules Oppert in France, he cracked a code that had been unreadable for 2,000 years. Suddenly, the tens of thousands of clay tablets sitting in museum storerooms and excavation sites across Mesopotamia were no longer silent. They began to speak. And what they said was astonishing. The tablets contained not just trade records and grain inventories, though there were plenty of those. They contained hymns, love poems, legal codes that showed a sophisticated society with clear rules about property and justice and the rights of individuals. They contained medical texts listing symptoms and treatments, mathematical tables showing that the ancient Sumerians understood geometry and algebra and could calculate the movements of the stars. They contained myths and creation stories of breathtaking complexity, including a flood story that predated the biblical account of Noah by more than 1,000 years and bore striking similarities to it, sending shockwaves through the religious and academic communities of the 19th century that are still being felt today. And they contained, discovered on a set of tablets excavated from the ruins of the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh and translated in 1872 by a young self-taught scholar named George Smith, who reportedly became so excited upon reading the first lines that he began removing his clothes in the middle of the British Museum, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The oldest written story in human history. A tale of friendship, loss, the search for immortality, and the acceptance of death, written in wedge-shaped marks on clay tablets more than 4,000 years ago, and still capable of making a modern reader stop, look up from the page, and feel something true. The discovery of the oldest written language did not happen in a single moment. It happened over centuries of effort, through the work of hundreds of patient, brilliant, obsessed individuals who refused to accept that the past was silent. It happened because of cliff-scaling army officers and self-taught museum assistants and German scholars working by candlelight and French linguists arguing passionately about the correct pronunciation of ancient vowels. It happened because of the clay itself, that humble, abundant, unassuming material that the people of ancient Sumer pressed their thoughts into and then left to dry in the Mesopotamian sun, not knowing that they were creating something that would outlast their buildings, their empire, their language, their gods, and almost everything else they had ever made. Writing began as a way to count grain. It grew into a way to record law and celebrate kings. And then, gradually, inevitably, beautifully, it became something that nobody had planned or predicted or even intended. It became the way human beings reached across time to touch each other. It became the way the dead could still speak to the living. It became the way a poet in ancient Sumer could describe the grief of losing a friend and have a stranger 4,000 years later read those words and feel, with sudden and unexpected force, that the grief is familiar. That the longing is recognizable. That the person who wrote those words in wet clay with a reed stylus was not so different from the person reading them today. Writing did not just record civilization. Writing made civilization possible. And it began not with genius or inspiration or a single brilliant invention, but with a very practical problem. Too much grain, too many transactions, too many things to remember, and a group of anonymous, inventive, endlessly resourceful people who decided that the solution was to stop relying on memory alone and start marking the world instead. They marked it in clay. And the marks lasted forever. And somewhere in the ruins of ancient Uruk, buried under 5,000 years of dust and silence, a clay tablet pressed flat by an ancient thumb and marked with a pointed stick is still waiting to be found. Still patient. Still carrying its message. Still absolutely certain that sooner or later, the right person will come along, brush away the centuries, and finally hear what it has been trying to say.